In the opening days of January 1942, celebrations erupted throughout Tokyo as military officials surveyed the astonishing territorial gains achieved by Japanese forces in just weeks of warfare. Within the walls of the Imperial Combined Fleet's Operational Center, Admiral Yamamoto convened with his Chief of Staff Matome Ugaki to chart the next phase of Japan's Pacific strategy. Reports streaming in from the Philippines, Malaya, and territories stretching southward painted a picture of imminent Japanese dominance across East Asia. Yamamoto directed Ugaki to have comprehensive plans prepared by mid-February for whatever operations would follow the conquest already underway. The rapidity of Japanese military success had shocked planners throughout Tokyo, creating sharp divisions within the Imperial General Staff. Militant nationalists advocated pressing forward with maximum force, extending Japanese power as far as military capability would permit. Yet another faction, led by the thoughtful Admiral Yamamoto, harbored serious reservations about the war's trajectory. His concerns about Japan's ability to sustain conflict against the combined industrial might of the Western powers had made him controversial in Tokyo's highest circles. Friends on the General Staff worried enough about his outspoken opposition to unlimited war that they felt safer with him commanding from his flagship Yamato rather than remaining in the capital where assassination might be arranged by zealous officers. Despite his position at sea, Yamamoto's views remained widely known. His Chief of Staff recorded in his diary the need for sophisticated diplomatic maneuvering once initial victories concluded, sentiments that reflected Yamamoto's constant warnings to colleagues. 3 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had shared his strategic vision with Ryoichi Sasakawa, president of the nationalist Kokusu-do organization, during a meeting at the Imperial Navy Club in Shiba. The admiral had predicted that war with America was inevitable, given decisions already made by Japan's political leadership. He explained his famous metaphor to his friend. Initially, Japanese forces would advance like an octopus extending its tentacles across the Pacific. Yet, Yamamoto warned that this expansion could not continue indefinitely. The window for achieving Japanese objectives was remarkably narrow. When Singapore fell, he predicted British morale would collapse and Indian populations might prove receptive to peace negotiations. Yamamoto's intimate knowledge of Western powers derived from his years as Japanese naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928, and his participation in the London naval conferences of 1930 and 1934. He understood that while a quick, dramatic victory was essential to intimidate the Allies into negotiations, Japan had perhaps 18 months at most before the industrial superiority of America would become decisively apparent. He urged Sasakawa to convey this message to right-wing political leaders who held power, emphasizing the critical importance of achieving a negotiated peace before that window closed. By January 5, the moment seemed propitious for such negotiations. The American battleship fleet had been devastated at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. British naval power in the Far East had been shattered when the Repulse and Prince of Wales were sunk off the Malayan coast. Manila and the Cavite naval base had fallen to Japanese assault. Hong Kong had surrendered. Japanese invasion forces were moving into the Dutch East Indies, establishing positions at Rabaul, New Ireland, Ambon, and throughout the Solomon Islands chain. Yet the attack on Pearl Harbor had failed to achieve one critical objective. The American aircraft carriers had been at sea during the assault and remained unharmed, representing an ongoing threat to Japanese naval supremacy. Yamamoto recognized that he needed a spectacular naval victory to establish the conditions for peace negotiations. While he anticipated Singapore would fall within 5 or 6 months, he could not wait that long. His planning staff faced the challenge of determining where to strike next. When Yamamoto proposed attacking Soviet territory, the Japanese army rejected the idea outright. Army forces were already stretched thin in China and Southeast Asia and could not support an extended land campaign in the north. Three alternative operational concepts emerged for consideration. Yamamoto's preferred strategy involved striking into the Indian Ocean, attacking Ceylon to draw out the British Eastern Fleet and destroy it, as he had destroyed American battleships at Pearl Harbor. Following this victory, Japanese forces would advance toward the Middle East to link up with German armies pushing toward the Caucasus oil fields, ensuring Japan's fuel security indefinitely. However, the army refused to authorize operations extending that far westward. The Naval General Staff in Tokyo proposed an alternative, an invasion of Australia itself. The strategy called for Japanese forces to move through the Solomon Islands, capture New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, then assault Australia to eliminate it as a forward American base. Imperial General Headquarters had already begun establishing occupation administrations for both Australia and New Zealand. Yamamoto rejected this plan as requiring too much time and lacking the dramatic impact necessary to shock the Allies into peace. Yamamoto understood that the Pearl Harbor attack had awakened something dangerous in the American people. The Japanese leadership had consistently dismissed Americans as soft, lacking the warrior spirit necessary for prolonged conflict. Yet, Yamamoto knew better. He recognized that even Singapore's capture would not deter American determination. What Japan required was a victory so overwhelming that it would provide Japanese political leaders with the foundation for offering magnanimous peace terms that the Americans might accept. In January, Yamamoto ordered his staff to develop an additional operational plan. 2 months later, officers delivered to Tokyo the document designated Operation MI, which outlined a grand naval battle centered on Midway Island, where the remaining American carrier force would be annihilated. Simultaneously, Yamamoto submitted Operation AL, which detailed invasion plans for the North American continent through Alaska, with the ultimate possibility of occupying Hawaii and potentially threatening the American West Coast itself. Yamamoto believed that victories at both Midway and in the Aleutians would provide the diplomatic leverage necessary for the peace settlement he sought. In Tokyo's Navy Ministry, admirals quarreled fiercely around conference tables over strategy. Ultimately, Yamamoto's will prevailed. The critical importance of Singapore's fall in February and the impending collapse of Bataan and Corregidor, either of which might have served as the diplomatic catalyst Yamamoto required, became eclipsed by a single event. On April 18, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle led a squadron of B-25 bombers in a raid on Tokyo itself. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership was profound. The Americans, far from being defeated and demoralized, had demonstrated the capacity to strike at the Japanese homeland. The Imperial High Command concluded that immediate and decisive action was required. In June, Operation MI unfolded as planned, but the battle off Midway Island became a catastrophic defeat for Japan. 4 fleet carriers were destroyed in a single day. The Japanese Navy's officer corps suppressed news of the disaster, restricting knowledge of the full extent of the loss to the highest command levels. While Yamamoto had been occupied with his Midway offensive, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo had been systematically moving naval and air forces southward to execute the operation against Australia that Yamamoto had rejected. Japanese naval forces had occupied Rabaul on January 23, 1942. From that base, they conducted continuous air reconnaissance and bombing raids against islands throughout the region and against New Guinea. Australian officials, alarmed by this activity, communicated their concerns to General Douglas MacArthur upon his arrival in March. It was evident that Japanese operations would soon focus on New Guinea. Success there would make the conquest of northern Australia almost inevitable. In February, Japanese bombers struck Darwin. In March, when Japanese forces invaded Salamaua in New Guinea, the pace of operations accelerated. In May, just before the Midway engagement, Japanese occupation forces moved toward Port Moresby, but were repulsed by fierce American and Australian defense in the carrier battle of the Coral Sea. The Japanese did occupy Tulagi north of Guadalcanal and constructed a seaplane base there. The Coral Sea engagement convinced planners in Washington and Australia that they must prepare for a major Japanese offensive in the south. MacArthur warned the Australian government that attack was imminent and cabled General Marshall requesting 2 aircraft carriers and 1,000 aircraft. However, Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, informed Marshall that until the end of June, only 2 operational carriers would be available in the entire Pacific. Meanwhile, the Japanese possessed 10 carriers. Pacific Fleet Commander Chester W. Nimitz issued advance warnings about the major Japanese operation he expected, which materialized as the Midway engagement. While the battle at Midway consumed attention, Japanese forces were establishing themselves throughout New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Major General Tomaro Hari landed the South Seas Force at Salamaua, and naval personnel occupied Lae while beginning construction of an airfield. Independent of Admiral Yamamoto's strategic calculations, the Imperial General Staff had planned the Port Moresby operation and ordered Lieutenant General Harukichi Hotake to advance toward New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, with orders to resume the offensive against Port Moresby in July following Yamamoto's anticipated return with the combined fleet. Despite the Midway disaster, which was officially reported as a victory to field commanders, Imperial General Headquarters did not alter its strategic plans. Days after Midway, Australians informed MacArthur that Japanese forces were preparing to advance. In light of the reported Midway victory, MacArthur proposed an Allied preemptive strike against the New Britain and New Ireland region, followed by an assault on Rabaul, Japan's primary naval and air base in the area. With 2 carriers, 1,000 aircraft, and an amphibious division, MacArthur believed he could force the Japanese back to Truk. On June 12, General Marshall presented MacArthur's plan to Admiral King with modifications. King proposed 3 carriers instead of 2, plus 1 Marine division and 3 Army divisions. King opposed the concept because it would place MacArthur in command of the operation, and because the carriers would be vulnerable to land-based air attacks and insufficiently protected. In reality, these tactical problems would confront the Navy regardless of operational planning. King developed an alternative strategy, a drive from the New Hebrides utilizing forces under Navy command. MacArthur objected to subordinating his army forces to naval authority, yet nobody could deny the necessity of stopping the Japanese before they conquered New Guinea and positioned themselves to attack Australia. The Joint Chiefs of Staff faced the challenge of determining command structure. They assigned Admiral King responsibility for Phase 1, the primary task of seizing the Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi, and adjacent positions. Guadalcanal, merely a spot on maps with no known tactical or strategic value, received no specific designation in the JCS plan. General MacArthur received the Consolation Prize. After Phase 1, he would assume command and mop up remaining Japanese forces throughout the Solomons, Rabaul, and New Guinea. King prevailed because the Joint Chiefs recognized that he had already developed a comprehensive defense line down the Pacific to protect Australia. His approach required fewer forces than MacArthur's ambitious plan. Thousands of troops were training in New Caledonia. King had convinced General Arnold to deploy several squadrons of Army Air Force aircraft there. He had reinforced Samoa and Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides and planned to establish a base in Tonga. Admiral Wilson Brown, whose hesitation during the Wake Island crisis had irritated King, was reassigned to a newly formed amphibious training command in San Diego, where he and Marine Major General Holland Smith were tasked with developing new techniques for island warfare. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, King's chief plans officer, recommended that the first phase must establish a holding line in the South Pacific while training amphibious forces. The second stage would involve a combined offensive by American, Australian, and New Zealand forces through the Solomon Islands toward the Bismarck Archipelago and Admiralty Islands. The third stage would encompass seizure of the Caroline and Marshall Islands. The fourth stage would advance toward either the Dutch East Indies or the Philippines. King approved this comprehensive strategy, which aligned with his own vision. He arranged to transfer Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley from his position as naval observer in London to command the South Pacific Force. King detached Rear Admiral Turner from the Plans Division and ordered him to prepare to assume command of the amphibious operation. These arrangements were made even before Japanese forces assaulted Port Moresby and Tulagi. Vice Admiral Gormley departed Washington on May 1st. He would assume command of the South Pacific Force on June 19, but first had to report to Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor, who would serve as his direct superior. By the time Gormley reached Pearl Harbor, the Japanese offensive in the South Pacific was already commencing. On May 22, Army aircraft spotted a Japanese photo reconnaissance plane photographing Guadalcanal. Army intelligence suggested that the Japanese were preparing to construct an airfield on the island. On June 25, intelligence reported that grass on the island's central plain had been burned and tents erected. A wharf was under construction at Lunga. 6 days later, an Australian coast watcher on Guadalcanal reported that airfield construction awaited only the arrival of Japanese construction units. He identified them specifically, the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, equivalent to American CB units. Radio intercepts by Nimitz's intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor confirmed the information. The Pacific Fleet's Radio Intelligence Group, which had broken portions of the Japanese naval code, intercepted a message stating that the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces would arrive at their destination on July 4th. Fleet intelligence connected the pieces of the puzzle. Admiral Turner happened to be visiting Pearl Harbor that day while en route to prepare for amphibious operations somewhere in the South Pacific. When Admiral Nimitz received the radio intelligence report, Turner understood where he was going. It could be nowhere but the Solomon Islands. Within 2 weeks, Turner was in Wellington, where he boarded his flagship, the USS Macaulay, a former Graceline passenger vessel. His task was to train an entire amphibious task force in 1 month. As Turner began reorganizing ships and personnel, Admiral Gormley traveled to Melbourne to confer with General MacArthur. Gormley arrived in New Zealand harboring serious doubts about the feasibility of staging an amphibious operation conducted by forces with minimal training or experience. MacArthur, who possessed his own reasons for opposing the plan, agreed completely. Both officers concluded that with available aircraft, they could not guarantee adequate air coverage for the landing. This meeting occurred on July 18, with the landing scheduled for 3 weeks hence. Gormley dispatched a message to Washington recommending that the operation be postponed. Admiral King's response was unambiguous. The invasion would proceed as scheduled. King had informed his new commander that he was assigning a difficult task and that proper resources would not be available until perhaps autumn. No delay would be authorized. Gormley had departed Washington convinced that American forces were unprepared for aggressive operations in the South Pacific. His pessimism deepened when efforts to obtain construction battalions and other units from New Zealand failed. Intelligence failures plagued the Guadalcanal operation from its inception. All concerned commands knew that some operation was planned, particularly after July 10, when Admiral Nimitz issued operational orders to Gormley. Everyone understood that Japanese aircraft from Rabaul could reach Guadalcanal, refuel, and strike at Australian installations. Yet the intelligence summary reaching King on July 10 contained only a casual reference to airfield construction on Guadalcanal, and days later another report misidentified the location of the airfield on the opposite side of the island. By month's end, the Japanese had completed the airfield. At Combined Fleet Headquarters in Japan, Admiral Yamamoto issued orders that the first operational mission would depart Rabaul on August 14. As commander of the overall American operation, Admiral Gormley made desperate attempts to secure additional resources, establish advanced bases, and obtain additional aircraft. Everywhere he turned, he encountered the reality of Admiral King's assertion that proper tools would not be forthcoming. The invasion force supplies, for example, had been loaded haphazardly aboard transports at Oakland. Although Oakland possessed adequate dock facilities for proper organization and reloading according to anticipated use, the ships were instead sent to Noumea, which lacked such facilities. Admiral King understood the difficulties but recognized that delay was impossible. He comprehended better than his subordinates the absolute necessity of stopping the Japanese before they reached Australia. The timetable remained firm. By late July, the mobilization was complete. 177,000 Marines were moving aboard troop ships from California, Pearl Harbor, Noumea, and Samoa. Admiral Gormley was too preoccupied to convene a commanders' conference. However, on July 28, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, the designated tactical commander, called a meeting aboard his flagship, the carrier Saratoga. For the first time, tactical unit commanders gathered to discuss the invasion. Admiral Fletcher's responsibility was protecting the landing with his task force. Admiral Turner would deliver the troops of Marine General Alexander Vandergrift. Once the Marines secured the island, garrison troops would be brought in, but the operation had been planned with such haste that no reserve forces had been identified or held back. No additional manpower remained available in the South Pacific. The meeting aboard the Saratoga proved contentious. Fletcher began by announcing that he would provide air cover for the landing for only 2 days. He insisted, and Gormley's staff members concurred, that the carriers could not be risked beyond that period. Fletcher was gun-shy, convinced that the entire operation was poorly conceived, hastily planned, and destined for failure. Admiral Turner, who possessed a more comprehensive understanding of the global military situation than anyone else in the cabin, chided his superior. There was no merit in such arguments, he said. The decision to risk everything had been made. Their obligation was to execute their orders. Fletcher should have known this following the Coral Sea engagement, when Admiral King had become so displeased with Fletcher's repeated avoidance of action that he demanded Admiral Nimitz assess Fletcher's fighting spirit. Nimitz, a gracious officer who regarded Fletcher favorably, had delivered an encouraging talk to the carrier commander. Following the Midway victory, where Fletcher commanded and acquitted himself adequately, criticism had diminished. Yet announcing to supporting troops and ships that he would abandon them after 48 hours struck an ominous note for the forthcoming operation. The rehearsal for the Guadalcanal invasion occurred on July 28 and continued for 3 days at Kororo Island near Fiji. Only 1/3 of assigned troops successfully reached shore, and once ashore, they demonstrated profound confusion about objectives and procedures. General Vandergrift regarded the exercise as a complete failure. Yet there remained no opportunity for remedial training. On July 31st, Marines were back aboard transports, heading toward Guadalcanal. On the afternoon of August 6, as the 75-ship task force approached the Solomons, Admiral Fletcher nervously withdrew his carriers. He maintained he would provide air cover as promised, but his 26-ship carrier group was being positioned as far from danger as possible. If American intelligence had failed to detect the Japanese airfield development on Guadalcanal, Japanese intelligence was even more deficient. As the American invasion fleet massed in the South Pacific, the Japanese remained ignorant of the forthcoming attack. In July 1942, the Japanese army was preoccupied with attempting to capture New Guinea as a staging point for operations against Australia and New Zealand. Major General Tomaro Hori's South Seas Force had landed 2,000 troops near Buna. Following the capture of Buna, the Japanese planned to construct airfields as a prelude to renewed attacks on Port Moresby. Consequently, in July, Japanese air power concentrated against Port Moresby, with bombers and fighters sweeping over the town and airfields almost daily. Following the landings, Japanese air forces were also committed to supporting the beachhead. In early August, their attention remained fixed on the New Guinea campaign. The combined Australian and American air forces responded with raids against Japanese air bases at Lae. During these preparations, Admiral Yamamoto's flagship Yamato was anchored at Hashirajima in Japanese waters. In leisurely fashion, he was preparing for forthcoming air operations over Australia and considering what action might be taken subsequently. On August the 3rd, naval air groups stationed at Lae were withdrawn to Rabaul in preparation for the Guadalcanal operations that would commence the following week. During the first week of August, South Pacific skies were cloudy, and only scattered Japanese reconnaissance aircraft ventured aloft. None discovered the American armada steaming toward Guadalcanal. Japanese pilots flying from Rabaul were startled to encounter American carrier aircraft in skies around Bua. They had been informed that American carriers were destroyed at Midway. The pilots assumed that these carriers were operating with Australian forces that had marched across the Owen Stanley Mountains. In reality, the Americans were training for the Guadalcanal invasion. No one in the Imperial High Command or in field positions suspected a forthcoming invasion. After 8 months of continuous victories, the Japanese found it difficult to imagine that the Allies possessed the capability to launch an amphibious operation. Had such an idea been suggested, they would have agreed with General MacArthur and Admiral Gormley that such an invasion possessed almost no probability of success. Therefore, as the American Expeditionary Force moved toward Guadalcanal, it enjoyed complete tactical surprise. On August 4 and 5, the 75 ships steamed forward under overcast skies. On August 6, the fleet moved through rain squalls almost continuously. However, as dawn broke on August 7, the sky cleared, providing excellent visibility for carrier aircraft operations. The fleet went to general quarters at 5,000 a.m., and at 6,000 a.m., the carriers launched their first strike. Aircraft from the Wasp, Saratoga, and Enterprise were assigned targets on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. The Japanese had established a seaplane base on Gavutu and Tanambogo, which were connected by a causeway. Japanese aircraft had been confined to base the previous day by adverse weather. Admiral Fletcher's task force reported one unidentified aircraft during the day, though whether it was Japanese or from General MacArthur's command remained uncertain. In any case, the Japanese were not alerted until 6,012 a.m., when the communications headquarters at the Tulagi seaplane base transmitted a frantic message announcing the attack. The radio message reached the 4th, 6th, and 8th Fleets, Admiral Yamamoto, and Imperial headquarters. The message was simple and direct: enemy heavy bombardment in progress. The weather had cleared, and carrier aircraft flew off into scattered cumulus clouds under a quarter moon. Fighters and bombers proceeded toward assigned missions. 8 fighters, led by Lieutenant L. H. Bauer, departed the Enterprise to attack Guadalcanal's aircraft, PT boats, troop installations, and supply dumps. They found no aircraft or PT boats, but strafed buildings on the airfield at Lunga Point. Meanwhile, another 8 fighters from the Enterprise maintained combat air patrol over transport ships from 600 a.m. until 8:00 a.m., when they were relieved by other aircraft. Bombers struck Tulagi and the Lunga Point area, but no enemy air activity was observed throughout the morning. The Americans had complete air superiority, and only damage inflicted was from operational accidents. Aircraft from other carriers struck the seaplane base at Gavutu, achieving complete surprise. American planes arrived and commenced bombing and strafing the seaplanes in the water. They destroyed 9 Kawanishi H-6K floatplanes similar to the Zero, 1 4-engine Kawanishi flying boat, and 8 seaplanes that served as search aircraft and bombers. Several Japanese pilots who attempted takeoff were shot down before becoming airborne. Not a single Japanese aircraft at Gavutu survived the attack. Other carrier aircraft struck Japanese troop concentrations on Tulagi, and some attacked beach positions where Marines would soon land. Before dawn, Marines on transport decks could observe the high mountains of their objective island. The transport slipped through the narrow passage between Guadalcanal and Savo Islands into Sealak Channel. As dawn arrived, escorting warships opened fire, and flashes illuminated the fleet. There was virtually no return fire. Bombardment from cruisers and destroyers accompanying troopships ignited fires along shore. An oil dump exploded, sending flames skyward. At 8:00 a.m., after 2 hours of bombing and shelling, landing craft began moving toward the north shore east of Lunga Point. Marines were nervous, possessing neither practical experience nor competent officers for such operations, since this represented the first American amphibious invasion since the Spanish-American War. At 9:30 a.m., troops were landing on Guadalcanal. They met no resistance because Japanese forces had fled into the hills. The landing was remarkably easy. Marines soon appreciated how completely they had surprised the enemy. They discovered wooden barracks that had never been occupied, tents with breakfast tables laden with platters and bowls of meat, rice, and cooked plums. Half-filled rice bowls were scattered around, chopsticks hastily abandoned on tables or straw mats. The tents themselves bore evidence of the rapid Japanese withdrawal, torn by shrapnel and flattened by naval shelling. Yet any Marine celebrating the ease of initial success soon encountered sobering realities. Although the Japanese on Guadalcanal had been surprised and had not established permanent fortifications because most personnel were construction troops rather than combat soldiers, the situation on Tulagi proved entirely different. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Marine Raider Battalion and the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines encountered determined resistance. Approximately 250 Japanese occupied the island. Troops from the Yokohama Air Base Detachment, commanded by Captain Hasaki Miyazaki. These were experienced, dedicated fighters. Edson's 1st Raiders represented the toughest American troops in the Pacific. All were volunteers, selected from a force renowned for combat qualities. The Raider concept had originated from Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's recommendation for creating a commando force. Carlson's experience included several months serving with the Chinese Communist 8th Route Army in its guerrilla struggles against Japan in North China. Edson's Raiders had trained for extended periods under austere conditions and possessed a formidable reputation. They would require every technique they had learned and would acquire new skills during this engagement. This invasion represented the first contact between highly trained American troops and seasoned Japanese veterans since the war's beginning in December. The Japanese possessed a reputation even more fearsome than that of the Raider battalions, earned through their phenomenally rapid advance through the Philippines, Malaya, and the East Indies. For months, Tokyo had publicized its victories, and half the world had come to believe the Japanese were invincible, a perception the Imperial High Command was pleased to cultivate. Tulagi would become the first testing ground for these reputations. Edson's troops landed at 8:05 a.m. on the northwestern part of the island. Initially, resistance seemed no more severe than on Guadalcanal. They encountered sporadic fire from scattered outposts. The northwestern portion of Tulagi was covered with thick jungle, small trees, vines, and bougainvillea, with its striking leaves and sharp thorns. Initially, terrain appeared the worst obstacle. Edson lost only one man to a sniper as Marines hit the beach. Edson planned to move inland toward a ridge running the island's length, then work along the ridge crest clearing slopes as they advanced south. However, terrain proved so difficult that 3 hours were required to chop their way along a 1.5 miles of rising ground. Reaching the ridgeline, Marines emerged from jungle directly into the central Japanese defenses built on the hillside. The Japanese had constructed dugouts and rock embrasures with machine guns positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Japanese defense was predicated on keeping attackers below them, but Marines discovered that, by crawling up cliffs, they could drop dynamite and grenades into dugouts, the method they had to employ for advancement. Once a dugout was blown open, it remained dangerous. In one position, Americans killed 17 Japanese with dynamite charges. One Marine spotted a radio inside and entered to retrieve it, only to be shot by 2 remaining Japanese soldiers. Another Marine following suffered the same fate before the Japanese were killed. One Marine section engaged the central defense position, while other sections pushed down the ridge. Even along the ridgeline, progress proved difficult. One company suffered 15% casualties that first afternoon. Frontal resistance was fierce, but snipers created equal problems, positioned in trees, building tops, and behind rocks. A favorite sniper tactic involved allowing forward Marine elements to pass before opening fire from behind, an approach that almost always meant the sniper's death, but usually only after causing several casualties. The first raiders learned that day that the small .25 caliber Japanese rifle and machine gun rounds were more likely to wound than kill. From the Japanese perspective, a satisfactory outcome, since wounded men required additional troops and resources for care. That afternoon, raiders advanced along the ridge until encountering a 3-sided ravine whose floor was an old British cricket field. The Japanese had dug into the ravine walls and established the interlocking fields of fire that would become familiar in subsequent months. As Marines moved forward, they encountered crossfire. Edson halted because darkness approached, and probing unknown dangers in darkness was inadvisable. That night, Marines on Tulagi experienced another innovation. The Japanese, knowing they were outnumbered with no possibility of survival, staged one of the desperate counterattacks for which they would become notorious. At 10:03 p.m., they broke through between 2 Marine companies and surrounded one. Marines fought from foxholes and open ground using rifles, machine guns, grenades, and knives. Japanese forces advanced along the ridge toward Colonel Edson's command post, reaching a point 50 yards away before Marines overpowered and repulsed them. However, one company lost half its non-commissioned officers in the savage hand-to-hand fighting. On August 8th, additional troops landed on Tulagi until 7,500 personnel occupied the island. Edson's raiders and 5th Battalion Marines resumed movement toward the southeastern island end. One by one, they assaulted dugout machine gun positions on steep slopes above the old cricket ground. From one cave, they removed 35 dead Japanese, some already decomposing, others killed in final moments of position defense. From this, Americans correctly deduced that Japanese doctrine required holding positions until the last, unless ordered to retreat, evidence of the discipline pervading the Japanese armed forces. Those few Japanese who surrendered on Guadalcanal were mostly Labor Battalion members, not combat troops. Raiders encountered numerous examples of a spirit unfamiliar to them. In one dugout, they cornered 3 Japanese officers possessing only one loaded pistol among them. As Marines prepared the final assault, they heard 3 shots. Entering, they found 3 bodies and an empty pistol. One officer had fired all but 3 rounds, then shot his 2 companions and himself. This suicidal attitude surprised the Marines. It was difficult for Americans to comprehend how cornered or wounded men with no hope of survival, knowing the enemy possessed overwhelming material and numerical advantages, would almost invariably choose death over surrender. After several Japanese pretended to surrender, only to deploy hidden weapons or explode grenades to kill themselves and attackers, Marines accepted Japanese surrender terms literally. Thereafter, virtually no further attempts were made to persuade Japanese soldiers to surrender. Tulagi was brought under control on that second day, though not all Japanese on the island were killed. For days afterward, Japanese snipers harassed American troops until eliminated. The experience of Gunnery Sergeant Angus Goss illustrated the stubborn nature of Tulagi fighting. He had advanced ahead of his men to attack a cave near the cricket field from which Japanese had fired sporadically. He moved close enough to throw hand grenades, which Marines had been trained to throw after pulling the pin, counting slowly and allowing the explosion to occur. Sergeant Goss pulled the pin, counted to 6, and threw. The grenade was immediately lobbed back out, forcing him to duck his own weapon's blast. After an identical experience, he held the grenade for 3 seconds, then threw. It came back out again. Sergeant Goss called for a satchel charge, a dynamite-filled bag typically used for demolishing buildings. He thrust in the charge, primed it, and ran back. The Japanese thrust the charge back out of the cave mouth, and the explosion drove a rock splinter into Goss's leg. The wound was not serious enough to disable him, but sufficiently painful to infuriate him. He picked up his submachine gun, dashed into the cave spraying fire, killed 4 Japanese soldiers, and counted 8 others already dead. Fighting on Gavutu and Tanambogo proved worse than on Tulagi. Landings there occurred mid-morning. Few troops were committed because nobody expected significant Japanese presence, but the seaplane base had been fortified and Marines encountered trouble. The Japanese were surprised and had not recovered from bombardment and aerial attack that had destroyed their seaplanes, so initial troops ashore met only rifle fire. However, when the second Marine wave reached the beach, the Japanese had organized and fire was intense. The third wave came under fire before landing craft reached shore and casualties mounted. Gavutu and Tanambogo were both dominated by small hills, not quite 150 feet high, but sufficient to dominate beach landings. The Japanese had built defenses along slopes and were well supplied with machine guns, automatic rifles, and ammunition. As on Tulagi, each position had to be individually captured. The Japanese did not retreat, and fighting on Tanambogo was nearly unbelievable in its viciousness. In early waves, Marines had landed tanks. Japanese forces surged toward the Tanambogo dock, where landings were occurring. They jammed crowbars under tank treads, threw grenades, and attempted to set tanks on fire with gasoline-soaked rags. One tank commander opened the hatch and employed the tank's machine gun to kill 23 Japanese soldiers before one scrambled up the side and stabbed him to death with a bayonet. Another Japanese threw gasoline-soaked rags inside and the tank burned. By mid-afternoon on the first day, it was apparent that Marines needed reinforcements. A unit that had landed earlier on Florida Island, where no Japanese were present, was called to assist Tanambogo. The island had been taken, but Marines were unable to secure the causeway linking the 2 small islands. Reinforcements were ordered to Tanambogo and, at dusk, received 5 minutes of preparatory bombardment from naval vessels. Unfortunately, one of the last shells struck a fuel dump near the beach, illuminating the shore as if at noon. As Marines came ashore, Japanese in dugouts on the hills had them clearly silhouetted against the sea. A steady stream of machine gun and rifle fire erupted. 2 boatloads of Marines reached the beach, but the coxswain of the 3rd boat was killed at his tiller. The boat slewed around and headed back out to sea. following boats did the same, believing orders had changed. The men of the two boats were stranded ashore with only the concrete pier for protection. The Japanese fired steadily. When Americans returned fire, the Japanese spotted the position by tracers. Soon, several men were down. One boat retired carrying wounded, and considerable time passed before confusion was eliminated and other boats began landing. Meanwhile, the Japanese launched a counterattack on the beach. Captain Crane, the unit leader, was cut off from his boat. He and 5 men hid in brush and escaped in darkness, later returning to the beach after Japanese withdrew to hillside positions. Eventually, they were extricated, but it was 4:30 a.m. on August 8 before another unit landed and secured the causeway. When fighting started, 500 Japanese occupied Gavutu and Tanambogo. When fighting ended, none remained. Early on the morning of August 7, the Tulagi radio station flashed the first word of the American assault to Rabaul. The astounding news reached the Rabaul airfield just as pilots of early morning missions were preparing to depart for another day, harassing Australians on New Guinea. Orders were immediately cancelled, and all available aircraft were dispatched to strike the American invasion force. Before the planes could depart, they received unwelcome news from Tulagi. The entire flying boat flotilla had been destroyed. Then, contact with Tulagi was broken, which could only mean the base had been overrun. At 8:03 a.m., a flight of 27 twin-engine Betty bombers departed Rabaul. They had been loaded for strikes against Australian forces on New Guinea, so they carried bombs instead of torpedoes. 180 fighters accompanied them. As they climbed to 13,000 feet, flew east to Bua Island, and turned south along the Bougainville coast, they were picked up by 4 Enterprise aircraft just after 1:30 p.m. The Enterprise fighters were flying at 18,000 feet when they spotted the large formation of Betty bombers escorted by Zeros just above Florida Island. The F-4Fs attacked. Lieutenant V.P. Deas shot down 1 bomber. 4 others began smoking and were listed as probables. However, after this initial pass, the Zeros joined the fight, and the F-4Fs broke off to take refuge in cloud cover as instructed. They had been hard hit. 1 F-4F had been shot down, and Lieutenant Deas's plane was so badly damaged he had to make an emergency landing on the Wasp. Lieutenant G.E. Firebar led another flight of 6 fighters from the Enterprise and found the enemy off Santa Isabel Island. 10 Zeros attacked at high speed, and 3 of the fighters were immediately shot down. The other 3 American fighters attacked the bombers, and Ensign R.N.N. Dis shot down 1. Betty, radio electrician T.W. Rhodes made the first kill of a Zero, but the Zeros pursued in force, and the F-4Fs ducked into clouds. 10 Zeros pursued them in 2 formations, attacking from the starboard quarter and following the Japanese rule of never letting your wingman out of sight. Lieutenant Firebar enlisted pilot W. S. Stevenson, Jr., and pilot machinist W. H. Warden were shot down. 1 coast watcher picked up Firebar from the water off Santa Isabel Island. A Guadalcanal coast watcher sent a canoe to rescue Warden off that same island, but Stevenson was not found. Aboard other carriers, the story was similar. Bombers were easier targets than fighters. 6 fighters of Flight 32 ran into enemy bombers off Lunga Point and shot down 4 of them. Machinist D. Runnan destroyed 2 single-handedly. Just after 2003 TPM, when Japanese Betty bombers and Zero fighters began their run over the islands, coast watchers were alert. Paul Edward Mason, a copra planter in peacetime, was stationed on Malai Hill on Bougainville overlooking Buen. At 9:30 a.m., he sent a message that 24 Japanese bombers were heading toward Guadalcanal. They were still 400 miles away, roughly 2¼ hours from their target. When that message was broadcast back from Pearl Harbor to the fleet, it reached the invasion fleet in time for preparations. The reaction of HMAS Canberra, one of the Australian cruisers, was typical. When the word came, the boatswain's mate piped the message, "The ship will be attacked at noon by 24 torpedo bombers. All hands will pipe to dinner at 11:00." The torpedo bombers came in right on schedule. American carrier fighters climbed above them to 20,000 feet as the bombers reached Guadalcanal's north shore and looked down on the invasion fleet. At noon, American carrier fighters and ship's guns were ready for them. For the first time in the South Pacific, the Japanese were experiencing the results of coordinated counterattack. American fighter planes were quite effective against the twin-engine bombers. Of the 24 Bettys that finally arrived over Guadalcanal, all but one were shot down. The only damage in that first attack was to the destroyer Mugford, which was struck by a bomb. Against the Zero fighters, however, the situation was different. Pilot Officer Soro Sakai, Japan's leading ace, was among 18 pilots selected for their skill to make this first long-range mission over the target. The Japanese force was jumped by F-4F Wildcats from the carriers, which went straight for the bombers, ignoring the Zeros. The Zeros protected the bombers and then turned to the American fighters. Sakai was puzzled by American tactics. Navy pilots dived against the Zeros, but if they missed on the first pass, they scattered and evaded. They had been instructed well by intelligence officers who knew that the Zero was superior in turning and climbing ability and faster overall. After a grim and skillful battle, Sakai shot down one F-4F and an SBD dive bomber that had attacked 4 Zeros single-handedly. Several other Japanese pilots made kills while 1 Zero was lost. Pilot Sakai attacked a group of SBD torpedo bombers, thinking they were fighters, and ran straight into 4 spitting machine guns manned by rear gunners who had him marked as he came in. His Zero was badly smashed, and he was seriously wounded, yet he managed to fly the plane back to Rabaul and land it before collapsing. The Japanese still possessed a temporary advantage in Zero quality, but already the Americans in their F-4Fs were beginning to learn to use the enemy's limitations to their advantage. Control of the air was obviously going to be hotly contested. At this moment, the Americans had the advantage of proximity with carriers close offshore, but the Japanese had the advantage of numbers at Rabaul. American efforts were seriously hampered by the superiority of Japanese Zeros over American fighters. Carrier pilots were flying the F-4F Wildcat, which was not as fast or maneuverable as the Zero. The Japanese could fly rings around them. The F-4F's one advantage was sturdy construction and armor protection, which helped keep the ratio of lost American planes as low as it was. At Rabaul, the Japanese recovered rapidly from the surprise of the American invasion. However, the problem for Japanese fighters was the 1,100-mile round trip. For that reason, on the first day, Commander Nakajima, the fighter squadron leader, resisted demands from higher authority that all available Zeros be committed to the fight. He dispatched only his most experienced flyers. He would soon be sending others, and losses grew increasingly serious, largely because of the vast distances to be traversed. By nightfall of the first day, the American invasion seemed secure. American troops had moved up near the airfield and had not encountered substantial resistance. One prisoner was captured who indicated that only about 600 combat troops occupied the island, along with 1,400 laborers who had fled to the opposite side. Admiral Turner had moved 11,000 Marines ashore, and vast piles of ammunition, food, and other supplies crowded the beaches. General Vandergrift noticed that the beach force was unable to assimilate the supplies, but, fearing the carriers would soon depart, was glad to see supplies still arriving. He did establish a second beachhead, but it quickly became crowded as well. At 8:40 a.m., on August 8th, Coastwatcher Jack Raid at WWII Passage spotted 45 Japanese dive bombers that had taken off from Cavan. 30 minutes later, Pearl Harbor repeated the broadcast to the ships. Carrier planes attacked and destroyed many enemy bombers, but American ships did not escape unscathed. A blazing bomber dived into the transport, George F. Elliott's deck, and set it on fire. One dive bomber sent a torpedo into the destroyer Jarvis, putting it out of action. That morning, planes of the Enterprise and other carriers took off on their missions and found clear skies. They strafed and bombed troop concentrations along the Tanaro River and worked over the airfield again. At about 10,000 a.m., 3 fighters from the Enterprise discovered a group of Japanese torpedo bombers coming in low over the water to attack transports. The Americans jumped them. Machinist Runnan shot down 1 bomber, and Ensign V.V. H. Rouse shot down 2 twin-engine torpedo bombers. Ensign J. D. Shoemaker shot down another. That was the end of air activity for the day. At nightfall, the Enterprise's Fighting 6 counted its losses, 6 pilots shot down by Zeros. The Japanese Zero fighters still possessed the edge in experience and aircraft, but American pilots were already beginning to learn tricks of the trade. The Enterprise Air Group commander concluded that the Zero had 2 major weaknesses: limited firepower and inability to withstand punishment. Because of the Zero's superior rate of climb, maneuverability, and fuel capacity, F-4F pilots were warned to stick close together. When attacked, each 2-plane element should set up a scissors movement, constantly turning toward each other. Thus, a pair of F-4Fs could concentrate their superior firepower on the enemy, while knowing their own planes could absorb enormous punishment. On the ground, Marines fought fierce Japanese opposition on Tulagi, Kavutu, and Tanambogo. On Tulagi, they suffered 90 casualties, but took control of the island by the end of the second day. The Japanese garrison of 250 men fought to the end. 200 were killed, 3 surrendered, and the rest swam the strait to Florida Island to continue fighting. On Gavutu and Tanambogo, Marines suffered 250 casualties. The 500-man Japanese garrison was wiped out to the last man. The fierceness of fighting on Tulagi contrasted sharply with the easy advance on Guadalcanal. On the morning of August 8, Marines reached the airport. They would name Henderson Field after a pilot killed at Midway. They were beginning to develop contempt for the enemy. "I wish those Japanese would come out and fight," one Marine said within earshot of Richard Tregaskis, the International News Service correspondent accompanying the invasion. "All they do is run into the jungle." On the surface, the Marines couldn't ask for a finer war, but officers were edgy that second afternoon. It was too easy. At sea, Americans apparently faced no opposition. A few Japanese patrol craft, tenders, and 1 or 2 transports caught offshore had been destroyed in the invasion's first hours by shelling and bombing. Only in the air were the Japanese giving Americans pause. Most of the first waves of bombers were destroyed, but meeting the Zeros cost 21 of Admiral Fletcher's 99 carrier planes. That loss, not high by operational standards, convinced Fletcher that his decision to withdraw was sound. At 6:00 p.m. that evening, Fletcher asked Admiral Gormley to allow him to withdraw his carriers. He withdrew before receiving a reply. When Admiral Turner intercepted Fletcher's dispatch, he realized that carrier withdrawal would leave him without air cover. The number of Japanese planes could be expected to increase sharply as the enemy brought additional aircraft down the island chain. As Fletcher began withdrawing, the Japanese were moving in force. When the invasion word had been flashed from Guadalcanal to Rabaul, Vice Admiral Gichi Maawa reacted immediately. Admiral Maawa was commander of the Japanese 8th Fleet and the Outer South Seas Force, meaning he held responsibility for the entire South Pacific operation. His first move was to load 6 small transports with troops and dispatch them with destroyer escort to reinforce the 2,000-man Guadalcanal garrison. However, The convoy encountered the American submarine S-38 operating out of Australia following the Philippines fall. The S-38 sank the transport Mau Maru with 342 men aboard. The sinking, coupled with reports of the enormous American invasion flotilla, persuaded the admiral that it was too dangerous at the moment to attempt reinforcement, and he called back the other 5 transports. By that time, Japanese naval assistance was already on the way to Guadalcanal. Admiral Maawa had been fortunate in timing. Early on the morning of August 7, as the Tulagi garrison sent its last message, 5 heavy cruisers departed Cavan on New Ireland's northern tip. 3 were headed northeast for Manus Island in the Admiralty Group, and 2 were bound for Rabaul. Admiral Maawa soon ordered all 5 cruisers to hasten to Rabaul. Shortly after noon, the cruiser Chokai, accompanied by a destroyer, moved into Simpson Harbor. The other 4 cruisers waited in St. George's Channel between New Ireland and New Britain for the Chokai to rejoin. When she came up late that afternoon, she was carrying Admiral Maawa himself and was accompanied by light cruisers Tenryu and Yubari. The Japanese moved toward Guadalcanal with 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer. As they sped south, Admiral Maawa composed his battle plan. By reducing speed, they could delay arrival until after midnight on August 8 and make a surprise night attack on American forces at the beachhead. The admiral knew that the Americans had several carriers in that area, while he had none. A night attack was a guarantee that he would not be harassed by American planes, since the Americans had no record of proficiency in night aerial operations. In fact, the Americans had no record of competence in any sort of night naval operations, while this aspect of tactics had become a Japanese specialty. Maawa's problem that afternoon was how to move close to Guadalcanal without arriving too soon and still maintain the element of surprise. He had to attack to support the Guadalcanal defenders, but if he could surprise the enemy, the effectiveness would be enormous. The admiral did not know it just then, but the nature of divided command, the inferiority of the American air intelligence system, and the lack of clearly defined search methods would all play directly into his hands. For intelligence about Japanese ship movements, the Americans at Guadalcanal had to depend on air search and submarine reports. Only under special circumstances would Coast Watcher reports be useful concerning naval operations. Early in the day, cruisers were sighted by United States B-17 Army bombers as they moved down toward Rabaul. That evening, the Maawa force was sighted by the S-38 just as it came out of St. George's Channel. That night, the commander of the S-38 reported the contact to Brisbane, but those 2 reports were not given much credence by American naval commanders. Rabaul had become the Japanese Navy's forward base, and it was quite normal for ships to move in and out. The Americans saw no indication that the ships in question were steaming toward Guadalcanal. Admiral Gormley was responsible for coordinating all elements of the American attack, but to secure air searches, he had to depend on several sources. First were the long-range B-17 bombers of General MacArthur's American Army Air Force and the Australian Army Air Force, part of MacArthur's command, which operated independently. Second was Admiral McCain's land-based Naval Air Force, which included seaplane tenders and PBY patrol bombers. General MacArthur's planes were to take responsibility for searching the Bismarck Islands, concentrating on the big naval and air base at Rabaul. McCain was to watch the northern approaches to the region, meaning Truk and the Marshalls. Admiral Fletcher's carrier planes were supposed to make short-range searches, but actually made none at all. Fletcher was bemused with his worries. Admiral Turner had looked at his charts and seen that the Japanese had a marvelous approach to Guadalcanal along the west coast of Bougainville, straight down between Shortland Island and Vella La Vella, past Choiseul, between New Georgia and Santa Isabel, and then between Florida Island and Guadalcanal's north coast. The lane was christened the Slot. Soon it would become infamous in American naval history. On the morning of August 8, 4 PBYs were scheduled to fly from Nandi on a 700-mile-long triangular pattern whose apex was the Fiji Islands. They would come up almost due west of Santa Cruz Island. 6 PBYs would fly search patterns from Espiritu Santo northeast over the Santa Cruz Islands and end at a point slightly above the Bismarcks, but far to the west of the Japanese task force. 6 PBYs would spread out from Malaita across the slot from Guadalcanal to search an area north and west of the slot. 3 B-17s were to search north of Guadalcanal. On the night of August 7, when Admiral Turner studied the search plan for the following day, he found the slot was completely uncovered. He asked Admiral McCain for a special search there the next day, but somehow, between Admiral Turner's flagship, Admiral McCain's headquarters, and the seaplane tender Mackinac at Malaita, the message was lost. The search was never made. Thus, on August 8, the Americans had left uncovered the most obvious approach of any enemy naval force to Guadalcanal.